Hey, good evening, book lovers of the internet. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe because for every subscriber, I get a new subscriber, and I also read a page from a book of my choice. So, in today's video, I am going to be reviewing an article I had to do for a presentation for university. Some of you might know that I had to review this article, and this one is actually called Imagination Our Commune by an author called Georges Didi-Huberman. So I hope you enjoy it. So this one was quite a big presentation, actually 30% of my entire grade, and I certainly hope I did well. I didn't really get any feedback, though I was asked some questions after it was over, and I feel as though I replied quite well. So shout out to my teacher, I suppose, and thank you so much to all the people in my class who paid attention to me and who asked questions after it was all over. Good afternoon, Dr. Grech and fellow classmates. So, my name is Andrew, and as Dr. Grech might have already mentioned today, I am going to be speaking about this article called Imagination Our Commune by Georges Didi-Huberman. It is derived from textual practice, and it is mainly about how the imagination gives us power to change the situation we are in, and whether this has to do with creating an environment imbued with justice, hence starting over, or whether to start anything else from scratch. The imagination is described as a powerful tool to bring change in any context, and over here the author mainly brings up the context which is political. And there were some points made which I did not particularly understand due to the language used, which was in parts difficult, but also due to the fact that this article is translated from the French. So, just a bit of a heads up over there. So, Didi Huberman brings in many different theorists, critics, and philosophers into his article who seem to have opposing views about the imagination and its effect in a political context. And this tells us much more than we perhaps need to know, but I'll speak more about this in the conclusion. So, these opposing views, when put side by side, create a broader understanding of imagination for the reader, and an overarching theme over here is one whereby the reader is invited to think about whether the imagination belongs to the individual or whether it is something that, since we all possess, technically belongs to neither of us. And of course, my interpretation of the article is also subjective and in part has to do with what the article is about. So now I am going to be dissecting the most relative points the article tries to make, once again, in my opinion. So, first of all, the imagination can be regarded as something that is simultaneously personal and interpersonal, so it is almost seen as something that one cannot fully understand alone despite possessing it, and imagination is seen as a powerful tool that can be used to create a change on a global scale, especially if we do not fear it. And I'll speak more about fear later on as well, fear and the imagination. So, one thing I have to give a heads up about to give you some context is that a commune is understood as a group of people who live together and share everything, but also maybe as a town or a village. So, that is what the author tries to mean by imagination or commune, and then he goes into whether it is something which we do share or whether it is something that is extremely personal. So, Didi Huberman starts writing about concepts which are more tangible and then moves on to ones which are viewed as more abstract. And he focuses primarily on Les Miserables by Victor Hugo and speaks about wood and the technicalities surrounding who it belongs to. And what struck me as interesting about this is that these technicalities can be viewed as rather silly, since words, when sharing the same definition, elicit the same response, and hence should not be treated differently. And over here, if you take a look at the article, you'll see the use of the adjective dead wood, which of course gives it a completely different context, but then the main point is brought up, and he asks the question, can we appropriate everything, render everything privatizable? So he also compares the way Marx spoke about communism with today's privatization and also exploitation of land. And in a way, this reminded me of what goes on in the movie based on the Dr. Seuss book um, called The Lorax. Maybe you are familiar with this. So things are taken to such an extent where even the air we breathe is exploited and the price is put on it, which is quite saddening to think about. But this is the political aspect the article tries to take on, and then imagination is brought in um, very soon. So it is also what is reminiscent of what is happening in our own country, though I don't want to go into that since it's not really um, related to the directly related to the article. So Didi-Huberman then goes on to try to define what the commune is, and this is a name assigned to a regime of practices, struggles, institutions, and research which opens onto a non-capitalist future. So he also moves on to speak about topics which are less tangible, for instance, the theme of common sense, and then this bridges into what the imagination is. So Descartes speaks of common sense as an illusion or an alienation, maybe even a deception of our own senses, but Aristotle then comes in and tries to oppose this view. He disagrees with Descartes, and he says that common sense is more of a sensible thing to do, so a certain commonality all humans can share and agree upon. That is how he tries to define common sense. And in a way, these two contradictory beliefs help to create the very concept of the imagination. So a contrast between the sensible and the intelligible. So in my understanding, when put together, these two create the imagination and our own commune, with a capital C over here, free power of reorganizing the world more justly. Um, it is one of the most important points in the article, as the beliefs which oppose each other create the very concept of imagination, and this is where the commune comes in. So it is a mix that we can perceive with our senses and know what it is, or at least what is very similar to us all, but at the same time, it is also what others are experiencing in a way that we are not. So we can't really directly say whether the imagination is something which is sensible, something we can all agree upon, or something that is in our minds in a way. And it is very subjective, which is also one of the main points this article tries to bring up. So later on in the article, Sartre is brought up, and how he mentions that it is lack of imagination that hinders our free power of uprising. So basically, he tries to say that the more imaginative we are, um, the the more it will be more easy for us to bring about a certain uprising politically, I suppose. And the article also mentions how the imagination has nothing to do with the fantasy in a way. It has more to do with our own understanding of it and real life events. So one more intertextual reference, which isn't particularly related, but I thought would be very interesting to bring up over here, is how the Matrix movies immediately came to mind, and the protagonist over here, Neo, is told that his reality is all an illusion, and he tries to break free from it. So in this article, the author is speaking about how society can do this in our own reality, in what we experience, without having to be told that our reality is a matrix or something that is non-existent, something that we've been dreaming up all this time. So the imagination is considered as the first of our political faculties, and thinking of this idea as a game of chess, so I tried to include the analogy for a game of chess over here. I thought it would be important because in order to win a game, one has to imagine the moves his opponent will make in order to come to a conclusion, in order to understand what is going to happen next. So another critic or theorist, Charles Baudelaire over here, he speaks of the imagination as an intrinsic quality and how community does not mean unanimity. So I will go into what this means very briefly. So even though most members of society do have the ability to use their imaginations individually, it does not mean that they all agree with the same change, and hence imagination as a commune does not mean that everyone thinks or interprets the world in the same way or wants the same change to happen, even though we all possess in a way the same imagination. And fear of freedom leads to the fear of imagining. So this is another important point, um, which is pretty straightforward, I suppose. If you fear um, freedom, you will fear the imagination, because in a way the imagination leads to freedom. And another theorist which the author of this article speaks about is Victor Hugo. So I brought him up earlier on. He's a French writer when I spoke about Les Miserables. And towards the end of the article, the author speaks of Hugo in relation to profundity. And Hugo interprets, I'm sorry for pronouncing the H, by the way. I know that it's not meant to be there, but Hugo goes into profundity in two different ways. He brings up the idea of imaginatives, and they are our way of seeing the world better in the present. So there are two levels to this for the author. There is the lowest depth, which harbors hatred, a vault made of ignorance, and hence also rage without imagination. And then there is the contrast to this, which he refers to as the mine, and he refers to this as something which is fruitful and just, and he thinks of this as a library which links together all the parts of the political and philosophical imagination. So now, since I don't have much time left, I will move on to the final points and the conclusion. So what all of this could very well result in is the concept of utopianism, and the idea of utopianism is that we get a perfect society which may be brought about using several people's imaginations, hence many ideas all advocating for change. Once again, not necessarily the same sort of change, and the imagination, knowledge, politics, and freedom are all very recurrent and relevant themes in this article. And he also goes into how new beginnings through independent thinking and hence power, referred to as puissance over here, um, are very important. And he also says this, which I thought was a very powerful phrase. He mentioned dare to think, and basically this is the what encapsulates the whole article in a nutshell. So the final few pages deal with color and the imagination. I didn't really go into this use of color and how it deals with the imagination, though the author does speak about color quite a lot, since he is described as an art theorist in the abstract, if you take a look over there. But color and tone has a lot to do with perception, and we have another person he mentions called Hannah Arendt over here, who speaks about color's affirmation of its own tonality, which takes time. And this can be applied on a broader scale, where tonality comes in, and the imagination can in another way be regarded as the destroyer of consciousness, perhaps. So it separates reality from fiction, and some might live in an imaginary world which never culminates in change in the real world, which I suppose isn't what Georges Didi-Huberman over here is trying to convey. It isn't what the message he is trying to portray. So, in speaking about all these theorists and their many opposing views, the author shows how the imagination is an extremely and subjective concept, and various critics think of its worth differently. And this is what builds the concept of imagination, what makes the imagination so interesting, and what develops it into a commune. So, this kind of like change through difference, I imagine. Um, Even though people think of the imagination differently, there is still an opportunity for a lot of change. And even though it belongs to everybody, everybody has their own thoughts about the way it works and what it means anyway. So, what remains most relevant, I think, is how the imagination can certainly be used for change on a political level, and that despite it belonging to us all, we all have an individual approach to it. So, those are my thoughts on this article by George Didi-Huberman. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, feel free to ask away. I can't promise you that I will be able to respond, but I'll try my best. Thank you for listening, and thank you for tuning in. I just wanted to pop in here with a final comment, so thank you once again so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, make sure to leave a like, comment, share, subscribe. Check out the rest of my content, my YouTube shorts, my community posts, my live streams. Let me know what you think of this, and let me know whether you have any other different thoughts about this article. Perhaps you've read it yourself. If you were one of the people who watched the video in class, do let me know in the comment section, and I hope to see you in the next video very, very soon. Bye, guys.